engineering, art, math, STEAM.
From downtown Louisville, Kentucky, STEAM features presenters from the 2016 IDEA Festival at the Kentucky Center for the Arts. Today's topic: the evolutionary roots of power and dominance.
I'm going to talk about power, and I think, like it or not, and I don't particularly like it, power informs just about every aspect of the human condition, from our everyday interactions with one another to sort of events at the geopolitical level. And as an evolutionary biologist who focuses on behavior, I've long been interested in the evolution of power and dominance. And so what I want to do today is sort of give you an overview of the kind of work that people who study evolution and behavior are doing on this topic, hopefully so that it can inform sort of general questions about power and also power in humans. So let's start with a basic definition. There are certainly many, but the OEP says that power is the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. And so you can imagine that there are actually lots and lots of different ways, different approaches you could take to studying power. So one thing you could do is you could study the use and misuse of power in contemporary humans, which is a very productive thing to do and has certainly led us to many new discoveries. But as an evolutionary biologist, when I think about that approach, immediately one thing that jumps to mind is that there's a problem with sort of your sample size, which is that you basically have a sample size of one. There's one species of modern humans, and so your ability to sort of make very generalized comments on why power is what it is and how it's structured is relatively weak at the level of how many species you're looking at if you're just focusing on humans today. So there's all sorts of alternative ways that you might tackle this and deal with that problem. One of them is that you might actually pick a period in our evolutionary history when there were multiple Homo species around. So here's a little figure that maps out our evolutionary history. Just to orient you, going up on the y-axis is time. So at the top is the present, and on the bottom is about 8 million years ago. And we're here at the red in the top left-hand corner. That's modern Homo sapiens. And if you draw a little box around the last 100 to 200,000 years, when most people would argue that's when Homo sapiens came about, somewhere in that range, it turns out that for various points of the last 100 to 200,000 years, we've roamed the Earth with numerous other species that are closely related to Homo sapiens. There are 5 here that I've highlighted, and the 2 that you might be most familiar with are the Neanderthals that were mentioned in the last talk, and the famous now hobbits that were found on a small little island in the last few years. So there are times when, if we go back in our evolutionary history, not all that far back, Homo sapiens was roaming the planet with other closely related Homo species, and that means our power problem our sample size problem becomes a little bit easier to handle. Now we've got multiple species. The trouble is that what we have are fossils from these other species, and while you can make some inferences about social structure and things like power from fossil evidence, it's really difficult, right? I mean, basically you can do genomics and you can look at the genetics of those other species, but it's much harder to infer social dynamics. There are ways you can sort of look at the distribution of fossils. You can look at whether or not there are chips in fossils suggesting aggression. There are ways around it, but it's difficult. Another way that you might study power and get around sort of sample size issues is you could study it across multiple contemporary human populations. So instead of thinking about it at the species level, compare across all sorts of cultures from all over the globe. And this has been a very productive way for studying power in the human sciences, anthropology, sociology, psychology, that sort of thing. Now all of a sudden, you've got lots and lots of populations you can work with. You can look at power within them, and also you can look at how power is distributed and used and misused across them. So this is a good way to study the question. If you buy that this is a good way to study the question, then really the best way to study the question is compare across many, many, many species. So why limit yourself to studying this in humans, even if you're only interested in humans, right? I mean, personally, as an evolutionary biologist, I'm interested in power across all different species. But if all you're interested in is power in humans, I still want to make the argument here that studying it across different species from an evolutionary perspective provides you with the ability to tackle things in a way that's just not possible otherwise. So in this comparative evolutionary approach to power, what we're basically going to do is we're going to try to develop evolutionary ideas about power and dominance, right? We're going to try to test some of those ideas across species. We are going to look for patterns that might emerge that help us understand the evolution of power. And then we are going to refine our evolutionary ideas based on what we know and the new things that we obtain, and develop new evolutionary ideas and test them, all with the goal, in this case, of understanding power. And the nice thing is that this approach has been used to study all sorts of behavior. Evolutionary biologists have done this for cooperation and altruism, something that I've been studying for the last 25 years. But you can use the same approach to study power and dominance and that sort of thing. Okay, so now let's do that. Okay? So now let's focus on power and dominance and related things in all sorts of different species, taking this evolutionary approach. And just to refresh ourselves, again, we're going to talk about power as the capacity or ability to direct or influence behavior of others or the course of events, right? So basically what power is trying to get resources or control resources in one way or another. Now, if you look at the literature on behavior in animals, immediately when you start thinking about power, you realize that power is often played out in aggressive interactions, right? In fights, in battles, in dominance interactions between individuals. So to start with, I just want to give you a broad survey of the sort of weapons that you see in animals that they use to fight and get power, get access to resources. So if we do a survey of these weapons, it's really quite striking. So here are weapons in a whole series of different invertebrates, and the black outline parts are the weapons, and you can see that they vary in size from small to large, that they vary in shape and structure dramatically across these different species. But over and over again, we see these relatively nasty-looking things that animals use to pierce, probe, push, topple over, do anything they can to defeat other animals in a quest to control resources, to get power. Over and over, we see this. And so if you look at the diversity of shape and form that we're seeing here in invertebrates and also invertebrates, you see that there's almost an infinite combination of ways that animals have evolved weapons to use for power, right? So if you combine the variance in structure and size with the variance in the way these things are used to push and topple over and pierce and do all sorts of nasty things, there's almost an infinite number of ways that weapons can be used by animals, both invertebrates and, it's difficult, in invertebrates and invertebrates, no matter what group you look at. All right, so we could go on and on and on. These are slides from Doug Emlen, who's an evolutionary biologist who studies weaponry, and I could show you hundreds, thousands of different examples like this, right? So all I want to get across there is that apparently, weapons are very, very important, which means that what you do with those weapons is important, and what you're doing with those weapons is trying to obtain power. So when we tackle this question about power from an evolutionary perspective, right, one of the things that we would do, we would look at this array of weapons in nature, right? And we would try and develop mathematical models that would allow us to predict when we should see fights for access to resources, when we should see power struggles, and when we might not expect to see power struggles. So for the next 3 or 4 minutes, I want to walk you through a really, really basic evolutionary model for the evolution of power. And then we'll start looking at particular aspects of power in studies on animals. But first, I just want to give you this sort of mathematical overview, because it's a really important technique that evolutionary biologists have developed, where we can steal models that economists and other people have built and bring them into evolutionary biology and make predictions about when we should see fighting and battles over power, and when we should not see them. We don't just want to survey the natural world, we want a predictive power. So here's the simple model. It's known as the hawk-dove game. So it comes from a part of mathematics, economic mathematics, called game theory. And it's called the hawk-dove game not because it has anything to do with the birds, hawks and doves, but here, hawk and dove is taken from the political economics literature, where a hawk is an individual who tends to rely on aggression to solve problems, and a dove tends to be an individual who tries to avoid aggression. So the hawk-dove terminology comes from there, not from the birds. So the model is really quite basic. We say, suppose that there are these 2 types of individuals in any population of animals that you're looking at, right? And the strategies that individuals can use are, 1, they could adopt this hawk strategy, which means they're simply going to fight for a resource. If there's something valuable out there and they want access to it and they want power, they're willing to fight for it. The other option that animals have is that they can adopt this dove strategy, which simply means that you might bluff being aggressive when there's some resource out there that you want, but you're not going to fight for it. And the question then is, when do we expect to see populations full of fighters? When do we expect to see populations full of these doves who won't fight? When do we expect to see populations that have a combination of these hawks and doves? And to answer that, we just need a little bit more information. So we're going to build this model, and in our model, we have to represent what the animals are fighting over somehow. What's the resource that they're struggling for power over? And we'll just very generally define whatever they're fighting over, the value of that we'll call V. So whatever it might be, a piece of food, a mate, a territory, whatever it might be, there's some value associated with it, high or low or whatever. And that value will represent as V. Right? And there's also the potential cost associated with fighting. So if you fight, there's a chance that you yourself could suffer injury, potentially really serious injury. And so we'll represent that cost of adopting an aggressive strategy to obtain power. We'll represent that cost by this C. And the whole model boils down to this. We build this little matrix that you see right here. And the matrix has 2 individuals who have met, and there's some resource out there that both of them want. And I'm labeling them individual 1 and individual 2. So they could be 2 birds, they could be 2 ungulates, they could be 2 insects, they could be 2 anything. And each of the 2 individuals has the choice to either be hawk and be aggressive, or be dove and be not aggressive. And all this little matrix does is it fills in the payoffs for every possible combination of interactions. So we want to know, what happens when 2 hawks meet? What happens when 2 doves meet? What happens when a dove and a hawk meet? And so we'll slowly fill in this matrix, and then we'll use it to make some predictions about when individuals should be willing to fight for access to power and when they don't. So first, we'll fill in this pink cell. And this cell will tell us, what do you get if you're a hawk and you interact with a dove? Okay? That's what the pink cell there represents. Right? So what happens is a hawk will threaten to be aggressive when it interacts with this dove. The dove will retreat because that's what the dove strategy does. They're not willing to fight when it's clear that the other individual does. The hawk gets the resource because the dove is not willing to fight for it, but there's no fighting costs because the dove has backed down. And so this cell then has the highest payoff possible to individuals in this very, very simple model. If you're a hawk and you interact with someone who's not willing to fight, you get the resource and you don't pay any costs. So your whole payoff is V, whatever the value of that resource is. Now let's look at what happens to the dove in that same interaction. And now in this pink square. Now we're going to look at the payoff to a dove when it interacts with a hawk. So again, what happens is the dove retreats when the hawk threatens that it's going to be aggressive. The hawk gets the resource. There's no fighting because the dove is back down. And so the dove gets a payoff of 0. It doesn't get the resource, but it doesn't get hurt and have to pay any costs. So now we've got 2 of the 4 cells filled in, and we just have to fill in the other 2. Right? What happens when hawks meet hawks, and what happens when doves meet doves? So if 2 hawks interact with each other, there's going to be a fight. They're both going to threaten, and neither of them is going to back down. And we assume that everything about our 2 fighters is equal, which means that they each have a 50-50 chance of winning, and they each have a 50-50 chance of losing. If they win, they get the resource. If they lose, in this version of the model, they are the ones who pay the cost. So losing a fight is when you pay the cost of fighting in this version of the model. So there's a fight, right? Winner gets the resource, loser pays the cost. Given that there's a 50-50 chance you will be the winner or the loser, your entire payoff for being in the hawk interaction, in being in a fight for the resource, is V over 2 minus C over 2. There's a 50% chance you win, you get the V. There's a 50% chance you lose, you pay the cost. And finally, there's the last possible combination here, which is what happens when doves meet doves. And this one is pretty easy, pretty basic. When they meet, both of them will bluff being aggressive, both of them will back down, and we assume that when that happens, what the doves end up doing is splitting the resource, right? So it's an interesting play on power in the sense that they bluff being willing to fight, but they don't fight, and they basically divide the resource in half. And in this model, we assume then that they're not fighting one another, they're doves, right? So basically their entire payoff is half of the resource, or V over 2. Right? So you can build these game theory models for aggression and power, and then you can use some basic mathematical techniques to take all this stuff that I just told you and then say, okay, given that this is all the possible combinations of interactions and all the payoffs that everybody gets, no matter what situation could arise, what do we predict to see in nature? And what happens is, what we find is there are certain conditions, certain mathematical conditions, that predict a population of animals that are all hawks. Okay? In particular, when the value of V is greater than C, this model says that we predict a population where everyone is going to be willing to fight for a resource. That's the way power is going to be played out in that population when those mathematical conditions are met. Other conditions predict a population of animals in which you have a mixture of fighters and non-fighters. And you can be very specific about what that mixture is exactly, right? So when the cost is greater than the value, that's the condition in which we expect to see a combination of fighters and non-fighters. So we expect to see aggressive individuals, and we expect to see individuals who are not, and some mixture of that. I would argue that what's most interesting about this really, really simple model is what it doesn't predict, right? And that is there are no conditions in this simple model that end up with a population where everybody is a dove, where nobody is willing to fight. The only outcomes possible here are a population full of aggressive individuals or a population that's a mixture of aggressive individuals and non-aggressive individuals. A population full of non-aggressive individuals is not a predicted outcome from this simple model. Now, of course, there are much more complicated models than this out there, but you just plug a few numbers in, make some basic evolutionary predictions, and this is what comes out. So that means that our general prediction here is that fighting should be the rule rather than the exception, right? Because either we expect a population full of fighters or we expect a population that has fighters and non-fighters, but never all non-fighters. And often we should expect that there will be variance. There'll be some individuals that are more willing to fight than others, right? So in our population where we predict a mixture of fighters and non-fighters, we see some individuals are willing to fight and some aren't. Right? And I could show you hundreds, probably multiple hundreds of studies that demonstrate that generally speaking, when there are resources that are defensible, you see individuals being willing to fight for them. And when you go into these populations, you'll see some individuals are really willing to fight for them. Those are the hawks, and others, not so much. Those are the doves. But over and over again, we find this general pattern of if the resource is defensible, fight for it. It's worth it. It gives you power. It gives you access to those resources. Some individuals will be more willing to fight for it than others, right? But in general, we expect to see lots and lots of aggression over these kinds of resources. And you see it in everything from mammals to birds to fish to insects, on and on and on. But what people who study the evolution of behavior have found is, of course, power is much more than just having weapons and fighting. Right? I think perhaps one of the most interesting things that comes out of the work on non-humans is that we sort of start here. We sort of start by thinking in a way of non-humans as these little robots, and some of the robots have really good weapons, and some of the robots don't, and we can understand we can predict when they might be willing to fight and when they might not be. But we know that animals are much, much more complex than that, which makes them particularly good with respect to understanding power in humans. If animals were just little robots with weapons, there wouldn't be that much we could glean from studying them. But they're not. There's so much in the way of subtle behavior that's going on in power struggles in non-humans. And I want to tell you about some of that work. So we know that experience really matters in the struggle for power in non-humans. In particular, when you look at animal contests, what you find are the equivalent of winning and losing streaks that you see in whatever your favorite sports team might be. So what we know from a whole series of experiments is winning an aggressive interaction does more than get you the resources. It does that, but it does more. It makes you more likely to win in the future. So the experience of having won a fight makes you more likely to win fights in the future. And you get on these rolls that we refer to as a winner effect. And so the personal experience that individuals in a population has real implications for power, because the more you win, the more likely you are to win in the future. Just because of the win, we can sort of experimentally show that the actual event of winning changes all sorts of things hormonally and neurobiologically, and it makes you more likely to win a fight in the future. Conversely, losing some battle for power, some battle over a resource, does more than deny you that resource. It makes you more likely to lose in the future. So again, personal experience here is really important in understanding power in non-humans. You get what's known as a loser effect. The more times you've lost in the past, the more likely you are to lose in the future. And again, we can experimentally parse out the actual experience of losing per se and show that that is important in understanding who's going to win fights, who's going to have access to resources, who's going to have power. We also know that these winner and loser effects, these roles that animals get on, either a good role or a bad role, it not only affects their own struggles for power, but it affects the entire power structure in groups. So I'm going to show you some work that a former PhD student of mine and I did on this question of how do these experiential effects potentially impact power structure in groups in non-humans. So I'm going to show you an experiment we did on swordtail fish. And these fish are great because basically you could put them in the lab, they get used to it very quickly, and they will relatively quickly start trying to beat the hell out of each other, which is what you're seeing here. And we've got just a couple of fish here, and what's going to happen is that within a few minutes, one of those fish is going to be dominant to the other, and you will know it because the dominant fish will have the ability to swim anywhere in the tank, and the subordinate, the one that lost, is going to be cowering in the corner somewhere. So they're just really, really good subjects for studying aggression and power in non-humans. So let me tell you the experiment that we did. We created a bunch of groups of these fish, and in each group we had 3 fish. So we've kind of expanded beyond this one-on-one encounter to the simplest possible group you could imagine, which is where you want to start, which is 3 fish. Okay? Now, what we did was, beforehand, we measured everything we could about these 3 fish that would go into a group. And they were similar in everything that we could measure, in particular their size. So there was nothing that differed between the 3 individuals that we would throw into a group, except their prior experience. So what we would do is we would create a group of 3. One of the fish had just come off a victory in a fight. And that was easy for us to make happen because all we had to do was take that fish and put it up against a teeny tiny opponent, and it would almost always win. But for us, the key thing was now we have one fish who has just come off and had a victory. We have another one of our 3 fish that has just come off losing a fight. And that's easy to stage as well because we just put that individual against a super large opponent and it will almost always lose. Those 2 individuals that I've shown you so far, they're exactly the same size. Everything about them is the same except one has just come off a victory and one has just come off a loss. And then we have a 3rd fish who did not have any prior experience. So it hadn't just come off a loss, it hadn't just come off a victory, but it was put in there and it was the same as all the other fish in terms of its size. We created 18 of these groups, and when we did it, after we put them together, we could measure the dominance hierarchy. Who was the top-ranked fish, who was the middle-ranked fish, and who was the last-ranked fish. And what we found was, overwhelmingly, the top-ranked fish ended up being the fish that had just come off winning a fight. The bottom-ranked fish was the one that overwhelmingly had just lost a fight. There's nothing else different about those fish except their experiences, and yet it determines who's at the top of the hierarchy, and those are the individuals get food and mating and good territories and so on, and who's at the bottom of the hierarchy. And in the middle, in general, was the fish that had no prior experience. So winning and losing impacts the power structure in groups. It's not just weapons. So it's not just weapons, it's not just fighting, and it's not just experience. In fact, it's more than that, we now know. It's all of those things, but it's more. And again, the subtle ways that power plays out in non-humans is really important in terms of understanding both that species that you're looking at and humans. We now know that animals are quite sophisticated about not overplaying their hand when it comes to the quest for power. Right? So if you're willing to fight, great. If you have experience affecting those fights, that's interesting. But you also want to see whether or not they can sort of gauge what's going on in the group in general and really pay attention to who's dangerous and who isn't in their own quest for power. You want to make sure not to overplay your hand. You want to make sure you don't end up fighting somebody who's likely to beat the hell out of you. You want to choose your opponents wisely if you want power. So our prediction here is that individuals should not haphazardly contest for power, but that they should be behaving strategically, paying attention to what's going on around them and using that information. So let me again tell you a set of experiments that we did in my lab, this time with a different PhD student, on not overplaying your hand or your fin or whatever it might be in non-humans. Okay. So now we have an experiment, and in our little tank here, we have 3 fish. 2 of them, the one on the left, are on the left side of the figure up there. Right, they're on one side of the tank, and there's a partition that's represented by the black line that separates that part of the tank from the other part, and the other part has, right, the third fish. So these 2 fish can interact with each other. Here's a third fish, and in this part of the experiment, the third fish could not see or smell or do anything with respect to knowing what's going on over here. In another part of the experiment, we had the same setup, except now, instead of a partition that they couldn't see through, we had a one-way mirror set up so that the single fish could watch what was going on between the other 2 fish. And I showed you when you put 2 fish together in a tank like this on the left-hand side, they're going to fight. The third fish can now watch that. And our question is going to be, do they pay attention to that? Do they strategically determine who is likely to be a good opponent for them and who isn't by watching what others in the population are doing? Right? So to test that idea, what we did was let's focus here on the part of the experiment where the observer can watch what's going on. So it's watching those 2 fish on the left-hand side, and they're fighting, and it may or may not pay attention to that what's going on over there. Then what we do is we take the observer and we pair them with either the winner of the fight that they just saw, we did that about 100 times, or in another part of the experiment, we take the one who was watching, the observer, and we pair them with the individual who had lost the fight that they had just watched. And our question is, do they pay attention to that? Do they act strategically on that information? And the answer is yes. When the observer has the opportunity to watch the fight compared to when they can't, when you pair them up with someone who has won the fight, right, they're very, very cautious. Right? They're less likely to initiate a fight with someone they've seen is a winner. What's more, if they do initiate a fight, they're less likely to escalate it up to the more dangerous part of the sequence that they can go through when they fight. So you put someone who's watched with an individual who clearly is dangerous because they've just won against somebody else, and the observer pays attention to that. What's more, they pay attention to the case when they're paired up with a loser. And here, what we found was that the key result was that when they were interacting with losers, they tended in general to be more aggressive than when they were interacting with winners, right? But in particular, they were especially leery of losers who had fought hard but still lost. Right? So this is really subtle behavior. What the fish are doing is they're realizing even though another fish lost, if it in fact put up a good fight and was really willing to expend energy to fight, they may not be the smartest opponent to go up against, even if they're a loser, if they've demonstrated they're willing to fight hard. So individuals don't overplay their hands. They behave strategically. But there's more to the story than that. It's not just weapons and fighting and not overplaying your hand. It's about building alliances and coalitions when you're trying to grab power. A classic example of this is alliance formation in the baboons that you see here. During the time when mating is going on in baboon populations, large males tend to have access to mating opportunities. Right? So there's one large, more dominant male in a group, and those males tend to have the most access to females, and they aggressively defend the females that they're courting with from all sorts of males. So smaller males have a problem. It's very hard to get access to a resource, in this case the resource being a female. So you want that power, it's difficult if you're small. What we know is that the smaller individuals tend to solicit others to come over and help them. They try to form an alliance so they can beat the larger, more dominant male, and the solicitor, in fact, can have access to the female. So what Craig Packer and others who study this system has found is that when there's a large male who has access to females and there's a smaller male who's trying to get access to the larger male's harem, what he typically does is he goes through this stereotypical set of actions where he keeps turning his head back and forth to another baboon that he is trying to solicit to join him in an alliance to defeat the larger male. Most of the time, that doesn't work. Most of the time, when a solicitor tries to do this, the solicited animal isn't interested. Right? There's not a lot in it for the solicited animal. It might help the solicitor, but if it works, the solicitor is the one who gets access to the females, not the individual who joined him in an alliance. What Packer found out, though, was that what happens is your probability of getting someone to help you when you want to take over, let's say, a harem of females, is proportional to how likely you were to have helped the individual you're trying to get to help you when they needed help. In other words, they keep track of who helps them when they need help, and then if that individual requires help, you give it to them. If you need help and there's an individual out there and you want to know whether they're going to help you, the key variable is whether or not you helped them when they were in their quest for power. So these animals are paying attention to really subtle things in their quest for power. And these alliances have been found in all sorts of creatures, from dolphins to chimps to lions to everything you can imagine. I want to finish up with just one more quick example of how studying power in non-humans can help us understand the phenomenon in general. One of the other things that we know is that when your quest is power, one of the things that you have to be worried about is making sure that others who might in the future be a threat to your power don't move up the ranks in your group. Right? If you're at the top and you have power, you want to make sure that you can do anything possible so that individuals lower in the power structure don't rise up and take over your spot. And one way you can do that is you can break up fights between others in your group in a way, strategically, so that you make sure that none of the other individuals in your group start getting on a roll and winning lots of fights that you're not involved with. Because we know that if that happens, they're likely to challenge you. And so if you break up those fights as they're happening, you can stop individuals from getting on one of these winning streaks and being more likely to challenge you. And we can build all sorts of mathematical models about the way that, exactly under what conditions that might happen. But we can also test this idea. And there was a wonderful experiment done by Mark Nielsen a few years back on these cichlid fish that you're looking at right here. These fish form dominance hierarchies in the lab, and they fight with each other. And what Nielsen found was that it wasn't just that some individuals would break up the fight between others. When I say break up, I mean they're not getting anything out of that directly, except they're stopping the fight between others. The reason they do it is strategic. They break up those fights that are between individuals, that if one of them should win and get on a roll, that individual will be likely to challenge the top-ranked individual in the group. That's when the top-ranked individual breaks up fights between others. I've only told you some of the ways that people who study the evolution of behavior in non-humans tackle these questions, right? But in general, it's sort of the same approach used over and over for different components of power. You develop evolutionary ideas, you test them across species, you look for patterns, you refine your ideas as you go along. So my hope in laying out this approach for you today is that this kind of work can be important in two separate ways. First, if you're interested in the evolution of power in general, across all species, right, this is the way you want to go. If you're only interested in power in humans, right, what I hope would come out of understanding this approach, what I hope that anthropologists and sociologists and political scientists will do, is take what comes out of these experiments, what comes out of these models, the patterns that emerge, and use them in ways to understand human power and hopefully sort of reduce the amount of aggression and fighting that occurs for access to power by taking the patterns that we learned in non-humans, by looking for things that tend to foster fighting or that tend to inhibit fighting, and applying them to questions of human behavior. This is far from what I do, but I hope that people who do this in various different disciplines will take this information and use it. And I thank you for giving me the chance to talk to you a little bit about this, and I'm happy to take questions.
I mean, a lot of this dealing with, from an anthropological standpoint, and with animals and other kinds of things, and translated to humans. And a lot of it's based on, access to resources, scarcity, those kinds of things. Are we in a situation, partially we in a situation where some of those traits, which are historical in nature, anthropological in nature, have kind of, like even what Christine said, have kind of carried forward in our DNA and other kinds of things into situations where they're exhibited in ways and in situations where it maybe not, in other words, maybe there isn't the need or necessity, but these needs, fighting over, in a sense, fighting over things or exhibiting power after power in areas where the scarcity and the resources really aren't that great as it was 150, 200 years ago in a village or a tribe or something, and yet we still have these incredible urges, needs, demands, and ever to kind of plow forward.
Yeah, so I think if you look at what the studies tell us about, just generally speaking, how much of the variance in human behavior we could understand by looking at genetics, which is so basically, if I understand the question, what you're asking is, we have this evolutionary past, and we know from studying the evolutionary past of other species that under certain conditions we might express power, perhaps when it's necessary in terms of getting resources, but also when it's not necessary in terms of getting resources. So I think in humans, certainly some of our behavior has an underlying genetic component, but at the same time, what we know both from non-humans and work on genetics of behavior, and from non-humans on work on the importance of culture in shaping non-human behavior, is that if you can structure the environment in certain ways, you can override the sorts of problems that you're talking about. So I think it would be pessimistic to say, well, we know we have an evolutionary history in which resources were relatively scarce, and conditions might have favored aggression in the quest for power, and therefore we're sort of locked into a cycle where, even though now maybe the costs and benefits have changed, we have this genetic predisposition to be aggressive. I think there's all sorts of information from both humans and non-humans that, even to the extent that that's true, that there's all sorts of things that one can do to override those kinds of problems. One is sort of education, explaining to people. In many ways, this is sort of why I got so excited about you asking me to give this talk. I think the idea here was to explain sort of how do you study power? How do you study the ability to try and dominate resources? And when we understand that, we can potentially change conditions. And sometimes that might only be tweaking conditions in a way that make it obvious that fighting for resources, struggling in an aggressive way, is not the right way to go, even if you only want to even if all you care about are the resources.
Okay. But let me move beyond just a minute the objective piece of this. I was amazed. We have situations in our world, we've always had, but recently, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi. Here are two people who literally could have saved their lives if they were willing to give up power. I think we all agree there was a time, particularly with Saddam, where he probably could have gotten out and we would have moved him to somewhere and given him $500.
Right.
But they were on their unwillingness to give up power, and the same thing's going on with Assad. Their unwillingness to give up power, even in the face that there was a high likelihood that they were going to die.
Right.
Superseded. That fear of death was superseded by, I can't give up power.
Yeah. So, when I discuss this sort of thing, I really want to be careful and open with this caveat that, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a social psychologist, and
But
so
you're
I'm
one today.
Okay. So, so let me tell you what we know about that kind of question in the area that I study. So it turns out that even though we spent all this time talking about fighting and getting access to power by being aggressive, it turns out that very rarely do you actually see battles and fights among non-humans that end in death. So almost all of the fights that you see tend to be for access to something, but the worst case scenario is injury, not death. And so there have been lots and lots of people who have asked, well, why is it that you almost never see the evolution of what you might call fatal fighting behavior? So you look at dogs or other canids, and you see that despite the fact that one individual could easily, in principle, kill another individual in some aggressive interaction they have. Same thing with chimpanzees. They rarely do it. And we think it's because, the costs and benefits of fighting are such that it almost is never worth it from a cost-benefit perspective to be willing to fight for the death. So when you talk about the Saddam Hussein case, when you talk about others like that, the only thing I would say is that while it's true that the potential of dying is certainly obvious to individuals in that scenario, the benefits are potentially so huge if you in fact don't die and in fact get whatever it is that you're questing over, that those are exactly the situations that I think evolutionary models would predict really nasty, fatal fighting. Only when the resources are so tremendous that it's worth paying the cost of. Now, the psychology of why somebody would do something like that, I think, is really going to be sort of culture dependent, but just sort of the cost-benefit approach.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Katie. I'm from Gateway Community and Technical School. My question, you kind of already went over the answer just now while I was standing here, but maybe you can elaborate on it. And that was, I know the hawk-dove game is a very simplistic version of what is a very complex model.
Right.
But looking at it, it seems like the cost, just from a straightforward cost-value perspective, it is always more profitable to take a dove-like approach. And I'm wondering if that's true it seems like that would be true even in a more complex value, because if two doves meet, you always come out with something, whereas even if you're a hawk beating another dove, you're taking a gamble on that of having to pay cost. So I'm wondering if that model holds true even in a complex system, if it's mathematically preferable to always take a dove approach, and if you think it's possible for human society to ever come to that realization.
Well, so in the hawk-dove game we talked about, I think one of the sort of counterintuitive results is that, you would think that if you have two doves who meet each other, right, and they don't fight and they split the resource, so they each get something, everybody gets something, that would be an optimal solution. But it turns out that what this model shows is that alone is never the optimal solution. And that's only because, under certain conditions, hawks do better in terms of cost benefits to fight than not fight. So the model never predicts just finding doves. If doves are in the population, we always predict some kind of combination of hawks and doves. And I would say that even if you get into the more complicated versions of that model, or almost any evolutionary model, I would be hard-pressed to come up with an evolutionary model in which the result was a population of individuals, none of whom was willing to be aggressive and fight over a resource. It's sort of like the other side of the work that I do on the evolution of goodness and altruism. It turns out that there are really no evolutionary models that predict you should have a world full of altruists and cooperators. You might have a world that contains them, but it'll always be mixed with individuals who are willing to cheat. And the reason is that if you have, in our case with the doves, if you have a world full of doves who are willing to just split resources, just imagine a single hawk who comes into that population. That hawk will be willing to fight for the resources, the dove won't, and it'll get the entire resource, whereas the doves that are interacting with each other will only be splitting them. That means it does better than doves, and that means you should get more and more of that type. So it's an unfortunate reality of the sort of evolutionary models out there that we don't predict worlds in which everybody is dove. If there are doves, they're going to be in a world that also contains more aggressive individuals.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Emma here from Louisville. So when you talked about the fish experiment and the winner and loser effect,
Right.
you made a reference to neurobiologic, I guess, tracing. So I am interested in hearing about the specifics of that, if the findings were related to kind of neural circuitry or certain chemical compounds, and if there have been any studies that have studied this in different species
Yeah.
or even humans.
Sure, yeah, there's lots and lots of those studies in non-humans. I would say probably the majority of them are looking at it from a hormonal perspective. Okay, so and basically there what they do is they'll measure hormone levels like stress hormones, corticosteroids, things like that are associated with stress, and they'll measure them in the animals before and after individuals fight. And so you will often see things like individuals who lose a fight, their stress hormone levels really, really increase. Or you see sometimes individuals who win fights, their testosterone level really, really increases. And so we know sort of hormonally the kind of changes that are occurring that might make it more likely. You know, if your stress hormone goes up after you've lost, that might help us explain why it is that you lose more in the future, because now when you go into those future battles, you're already stressed simply as a result of having lost. The neurobiological stuff, there's some of that, particularly sort of looking at gene expression in various parts of the brain. I could, if you track me down afterwards, I can hook you up with the references without getting too technical for everybody else. But there's plenty of neurobiological work on what happens when you win and lose a fight in everything from fish to birds to mammals. And we could certainly talk about that.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Annie Brown from Fort Thomas, Kentucky. Most of the examples you showed were patterns of male aggression and power. I don't know, maybe the fish were female, I don't know. But I was wondering if anybody has studied how it appears on the female of any species.
Sure. Most of the examples I talked about were involving males, but there's more and more studies being done on power structure and aggression in females. There are some, particularly in mammals and especially in primates, where you have this situation that the dominance hierarchy is really female-driven. That females really make the calls in groups, and there, I think, we sort of take the same general approach. It just so happens that we're looking at it in females versus males. Now, but I will say that the reason that for a long time most of this work had been done with males and power is that from an evolutionary perspective in non-humans, there's good reason to sort of start there, because it's usually males who have a lot more to gain by getting access to power than females, because males can mate with multiple females, and many times females can just mate with a single male. So that the payoff to winning power contests tends to be higher in males across non-humans, but there are plenty of examples where females are in control of what happens in groups. People are beginning to study that now more using the same approach, and I think part of that is due to the fact that there are a lot more women in science than there used to be, which is sort of a good consequence of having women in science. I mean, this is a little bit of an aside, but just since people are excited about that phenomenon, let me tell you that the same thing is happening in other parts of studying behavior. So for a long, long time, in evolutionary biology, when we looked at how individuals, how pairings occurred with respect to mating. So how did individuals end up mating with who they were mating with? For the longest time, from Darwin's first discussion of this till probably about 30 years ago, almost all of the work in that area was on watching males trying to beat each other up to gain access to females and mate with them. But there's another very, very interesting and in many ways more sophisticated way of getting mates, and that is by looking around and assessing the quality of your mates, and that tends to be what females do, whereas males tend to try and get into power contests for access to females. So for 100 years, virtually every study was on male-male competition. over the last 30 years, when the number of women in the part of science that I'm in has skyrocketed to the point where I'd say there's probably more than 50% of the scientists in my area are female, all of a sudden people began to ask questions about female mate choice. And it turns out that that part of the equation is perhaps more interesting than the male-male part, because the male-male part is sort of boring. If you win, you get access. If you don't. But how do you figure out who to choose? That's more interesting. And that's a direct consequence of having changed the sex ratio of scientists.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello.
Hello?
Caleb Johnson from Louisville. I was just wondering if there are any studies or anything from your field that looks at, particularly within the hawk-dove model, like situations that are forced into these dove-dove situations. So like if you had, like, say, survival in war, or like colonization, which has come up recently, of other planets, or if you're on a raft or something, like, just how does power come into play when you have people forced into those situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's not a lot of experimental work on that, but I can tell you, I think, in general, what people think about that. And that is that, when it comes to things like we're talking about today, power and fighting, also when it comes to the opposite side of the equation, being nice to one another, it turns out that if you want people to be nice to each other and not fight, it's not a particularly pleasant result, but it turns out that the way to get them to do that is to impose an external threat to that group. Okay? So, for example, the classic case of this is people saying, well, so how can we get everybody, how can we get all humans to be nice to each other? And people have, for a long time, said, okay, you want all humans to be nice to each other? Set up an invasion from outer space. When now everybody in the group you're looking at, which is now the entire population of the planet, gains by acting cooperatively and non-aggressively towards each other, but towards the external threat. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily is good. I'm simply saying that, when you think about it theoretically, that's often the way you can get people within some group, be it the people in this room or the people on the planet, is just sort of put an external threat so that they feel like they need to work with each other. Now, the nice thing would be if the external threat did not involve you actually having to kill whatever the external threat is. And that's where, trying to figure out what those might be is not easy.